Okay, good evening from those that are in LA, and good night to our main public in Brazil. We are here with the last lecture of the day at the 21st set of seminars from the School of Law Center on Law and Regulation at the University of Brasilia, and I'm proud to introduce you the Professor Hernan Galperin. He is going to talk about uh, broadband subsidies effects, the Affordable Connectivity Program, and Professor Galperin is a professor of communication at the University of Southern California and director of doctoral studies at the School for Communication and Journalism. He has a PhD from Stanford University. He's also the director of the Annenberg Research Network on International Communication, which I was very proud to be visiting fellow some years ago. He has published extensively in major journals such as Telecommunications Policy, Development Policy Review, New Media and Society, Government Information Quarterly, and Information Technologies and International Development, ITID. He's a member of the organizing committee of the International Conference Communication Policy Research Latin America, CPR Latam. And without further ado, the mic is yours, Hernan. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you, Marcio. Boa tarde, boa noite. A great pleasure to be speaking to you today. Thank you, Marcio, for that kind introduction. Perhaps on top, I would add, I am originally from Argentina. I was also the founder of the Center for Technology and Society at Universidad de San Andrés in Buenos Aires that still exists and is doing some great work, very aligned with the center that Marcio is involved with. I don't know if people were listening to our chat before, Marcio, but I live in Brazil, so I can understand Portuguese and I can speak sort of Portuguese, but I'm much more comfortable in English. So I will do this in English, but feel free to have the Q&A in Portuguese once we finalize this conversation. So the research I want to talk about today is focused on a fairly specific program that exists in the United States to support broadband adoption, particularly in the years of the pandemic. So I'm going to talk about this program called the Affordable Connectivity Program. It's a program that's one of the largest programs to support direct connectivity that exists in the US. The program, it was very short duration, about 2 years, but it's got a lot of interesting components that we did research about. It's very US focused, but I hope this has implications and lessons for other countries as well, because I think the challenges and the problems and the impact of this program is not unlike many other universal service programs that exist in Brazil, in Latin America, and really all over the world. So let me, you can see my slide. So let me start with a brief background. And I think this is also something that applies to many countries, which is that for the most part, the way we tended to think about universal service was from a supply side, meaning increase availability, promote network deployment, helping the network operators deploy service, perhaps where the market was thin, where the market was not mature, so the subsidies would help and promote deployment in those areas. So that's the most common way, the traditional way in which universal service policies were implemented from a supply side. This is a different program that I'm going to be talking about, because this is a consumer side. It's a demand side program. So it's trying to address not so much the availability question, but the affordability questions. The fact that more and more the areas and the residents are served, but for a number of reasons, including affordability, they are not adopting the service. So the ACP, the program that we're going to be discussing today, is a consumer-oriented subsidy program trying to bridge that gap between what consumers can afford and the price of the service. Now, the ACP is not the first time that this has happened in the United States. There is a program that still exists called Lifeline. And Lifeline is a good example of what I refer to as a program that was designed for a different era. It was a program designed for the era of the fixed phone and the local calls and the long distance calls, and is no longer able to address the challenges of the 21st century, but yet is very difficult to change Lifeline. And I think this is the case of many other countries where the programs that were designed, perhaps even back in the era of privatization in the late 1990s, and having difficulties because of institutional inertia, because of many other factors that make it difficult to adapt the programs to the new challenges and the new realities of the market. So one of the main problems of Lifeline, it's what's called its contribution base. Basically, is the money that goes into the program. The money that goes into Lifeline comes from long distance calls from fixed phones. Now, I think you would agree that aside from your abuelita, the word is avó? No, avós, no. Who makes long distance calls on a fixed phone anymore? So the contribution base has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking for Lifeline, so much that the amount of the subsidy has been fixed for the last 10 years or so. Today, the Lifeline subsidy is at $9, $9.25 to be exact, and it hasn't changed over the last 10 years. That fewer and fewer people are actually interested and are getting the benefit simply because you are able to afford so little with $9.25. It still exists. It still has about 7 million subscribers, but it's addressing a very small part of the problem. Is a very small share of the population that's taking advantage of Lifeline. So when the pandemic hit, the only program that existed was Lifeline, and clearly it was obvious very quickly that this was not enough to address the problem that existed during the pandemic. And of course, as we know, what happened in the pandemic is that as so many other things went online, education and employment and so much telehealth, all the services, all these important dimensions of well-being were now requiring to have a broadband connectivity. The pandemic was exposing those gaps in availability, but perhaps even more gaps in affordability, gaps in what people could afford. So as a result of that, the ACP program was established, and it was established in 2021 as a one-time appropriation of about $14 billion. That's a lot of money, but it's important to remark that it was a one-time appropriation. It was always conceived as an emergency program. And that's different from Lifeline, as that's different from the typical universal service fund, because this is not a recurring mechanism for appropriation. It's a one-time appropriation that it was appropriated by Congress and it ran out. The program started in 2022, and the money ran out about 24 months later. But it's a program that it's not unlike many other countries. Many other countries during the pandemic did something similar, and we can discuss, and I know some other examples, and perhaps I would be interested in knowing more about what Brazil did during the pandemic as an emergency to help people be connected during those difficult times. So that's the general background of the program. Now let me tell you a little bit more about what the program actually did. So it started in 2022 and again expired around May 2024 when it ran out of money. The program essentially offered 30-month indirect consumer subsidy for either a fixed phone, a fixed broadband, or a mobile broadband connection. So the consumer could choose between fixed or mobile or really any service. Now, the program did favor a little more fixed connections in subtle ways. In ways, for example, you could also claim an equipment subsidy to buy a computer, but you couldn't buy a mobile phone. So there was a few subtle ways in which it favored more fixed services, but it still was agnostic. The consumer could choose to either contract fixed or mobile broadband. Interestingly, it was not mandatory for ISPs to accept the subsidy. So ISPs could opt out of the subsidy. However, most ISPs participated. The vast majority of the ISPs participated. And in fact, what happened is that the majority of ISPs designed specific services for the program. So there were $29.99 services, as is common here in the US, right? There's a $29.99 service, which essentially covered the full amount. You could cover the full amount with the ACP subsidy. These were perhaps entry-level services. They were not the most high-quality, high-speed services, but most of the ISPs offered a service so that it was fully covered by the ACP subsidy. Now, who was eligible to receive ACP? And this is really critical. This is a big part of our research. Is eligibility was based on essentially two criteria. Income criteria, so that households, so HH means households that earn up to 200% of the federal poverty level. So the federal poverty line, you could earn twice of the federal poverty line. Up to that, you're eligible. Above that, not eligible. And there was also an option to be eligible through other social programs like disability programs and food stamp programs and so forth. But essentially, it was a very wide net. It was a very wide net. It was not a particularly targeted program. And we ran some estimations where about 51 million households, so about 40% of all US households were eligible. So it's a fairly wide net of households that were allowed to, or that were eligible for the program. So it's an interim program that was not just for the very low income, as is the case perhaps of Lifeline, but it's a much wider net to help not only people afford broadband, but also to lower the cost burden. And that's actually in the actual language of the law, is that the program is meant not just to help people get online, new subscribers, but also to lower the cost burden during the pandemic, to lower the cost burden of broadband. So those are the basics of the program. And as a group, we as a research group, we had several questions and several research dimensions of the program. One of them was around program targeting and enrollment. So who enrolled, who didn't enroll, how many eligible households did not enroll, and I'll show you in a minute that many eligible households actually never enroll in ACP. And one of the interesting questions is why so many eligible households never enrolled in ACP. And the second set of questions have, of course, to do with program impact. I mean, a program this large, $14 billion, there are obviously questions about, is this program effective? Does it have an impact? And we think of impact in two different ways. We call the first order impact is connectivity impact, meaning a program that is designed to help people pay for broadband should have an impact on the number of households connected to broadband. That's the very basic first order impact. But we also want to go beyond that, thinking ultimately this is about improving well-being. This is improving opportunities for education, opportunities for telehealth, and opportunities for employment. And we focus on employment perhaps because employment is perhaps the most direct way in which of improving well-being, if people that are connected can now access a broader set of employment opportunities. So I'm going to discuss some of our work around employment and labor force participation and whether ACP helped promote some of that, again, particularly during the time of the pandemic, when so much of the employment was migrating online. And even now, we're still, and I'm not so familiar with Brazil, but in the US, we're still in the adjustment period of post-pandemic of how much of the employment that was online during the pandemic is going to come back in person or not. And there's been a lot of discussions about that. So we'll get into some of this discussion. So let me start with, the first set of questions around program targeting and enrollment. And here's a map of the US, and each unit here is the county. The county is sort of the municipios in Brazil. There's about 3,500 of counties in the US. And you could see how the variance in enrollment rates around the country. Some areas with very high enrollment, which is a darker, some areas with very low enrollment, which is the lighter. So a lot of really interesting variation in the country in terms of how many households were enrolling in ACP. So this raised a number of interesting questions, which is, why would people not enroll in the program? What are the factors that are preventing enrollment and higher participation in the program? At the very peak of the program, before it shut down, the program had about 22 million households enrolled. And we calculated about 51 million eligible. So at the very, very peak of the program, it was still 45% enrollment. So you could say most of the people eligible were still not enrolled in the program. So this raises an interesting question about why were people not enrolling in this program. So here's the question: why are people not enrolling in ACP? Why is enrollment always never reach 50%? So this takes us to a broader set of questions around social programs and why people enroll and not enroll in programs. So looking at the literature, it's really interesting to see sort of very clear 3 lines of work on this. The first line of work has to do with information issues. People don't know about the program. People don't understand the program. People don't know who's eligible to the program. There's a lot of misinformation about the program, and this we saw that in the case of ACP. One of the examples is citizenship. Do you need to prove citizenship to enroll in the program? The answer is no, but a lot of people thought that they needed to be proof of citizenship. So a number of informational issues that existed in the program, also because information takes time to disseminate. And this was a fairly short-lived program, so still not a lot of the information was not getting to the potential recipients, despite the FCC actually having a whole line of credit for outreach programs, and the ISP is actually being required to do outreach, but still not all the people were well informed or even informed about the ACP program. So information is one area. What's called administrative burden is a second area, and this has to do with the hassle, the difficulties in enrolling. So this got better, but at the beginning it was difficult to enroll. You needed to go online to enroll, which defeats the purpose, correct? Because how would you go online to enroll in a broadband program if perhaps you don't have good internet? So there were a number of administrative burdens that were corrected along the way, but this is something that also research has shown very well, that those burdens exist for all social programs and often are the main barrier for people to enroll. They just can't get over all the steps, for example, to show that you are low income or to show that you participate in a social program. We, in fact, did some simulations where we asked ourselves, what would happen if enrollment was automated? Let's say everybody that has food stamp will be automatically enrolled. You don't have to prove it because you're automatically enrolled. So we made some simulations. But again, this got improved over the lifetime of the program, but it was something that kept some people out of the program. And the third one, and something perhaps that I was personally thought was really interesting, was this idea of maybe there's a stigma to participating in the program, the same way that a stigma exists for many other social programs. So there's an entire literature on the idea that participating in subsidy programs carries a stigma, and it's called the welfare stigma. And this is fairly well documented, so we wanted to delve deeper into this, because what's interesting here is typically the welfare stigma is activated when the act of receiving the benefit is very visible. You are in line of free meal, and everybody can see you on the line to get a free meal. Or you use a coupon from the government to pay in a store, and then the transaction involves you giving that coupon to somebody, so that's very visible. In this case, what's interesting is that there was no visibility, because you sign up, you call the ISP, you sign up, you give your information, you are eligible, you receive the benefit. There is minimal visibility, if at all. So our question is, how is it possible that this be activated when there's very little visibility to receiving the benefit? So we draw here from some literature on stigma that has to do not so much with social stigma, but what's called the personal stigma. So I won't go too much in there, but it's a really interesting field where the psychologists and the sociologists and psychologists are working on, with the idea that stigma doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be seen by others, that it could be activated when there's some incongruence between yourself, your self-identity and the identity that you associate with those receiving the welfare. And there's a long history in the US of something called the welfare mom and this stigmatization of the welfare mom. So we thought that perhaps this program that was very also associated with a particular government, the Biden administration and the Democrats, maybe was suffering from some negative stereotypes about those receiving the subsidy and general attitudes towards the welfare system. So in order to study that, so a hypothesis was, well, all things equal, the enrollment will be lower among people who have negative attitudes towards social protection. And we used two measures of that. One was a direct measurement. So there's a large survey that captures that, and we had about 250,000 individuals on that survey. That still didn't cover all the counties, so we also had an indirect measurement, which was the share of the Republican vote, and that's used often by political sciences and other scholars to indirectly measure attitudes towards government, which is the share of either Republican or the Democrat Party. Republican typically being with the party with more negative attitude towards the welfare system. So quickly to show you the results, we did see that. So looking at the wide the vertical scale, you see the predicted participation in ACP on the right and predicted participation of Lifeline on the left. And you see as the share of the Republican vote increases, the participation drops. It drops much more for ACP than for Lifeline. And we believe the reason is that Lifeline is a much more established program. It is less associated with a particular government, a particular administration, and it's been around for 40 years, whereas ACP made that more salient because it was clearly associated with one particular government, the Biden administration that put this into place. So it suffered more from that negative attitude from Republican voters. And when we look at the same, but using the other measurement, the direct measurement, this is a survey measurement. The survey asks, the question is, do you think the government should increase or decrease welfare spending? And if you look at the share of this of the respondents that say the government should decrease, greatly reduce spending, you see an association with lower participation in ACP. So again, these are ways in which we're trying to understand what role that welfare stigma played in reducing participation in the ACP program. Okay, let me now pivot to perhaps what's most interesting, which is understanding the impact of ACP. And again, we differentiate here between first order impact. Did more people get internet as a result of ACP? And second order impact. And we focus on employment. Did ACP increase employment, increase labor force participation? And if so, how exactly did that happen? So these are the questions around the impact of the ACP program. Now, just perhaps a side note on methodology. I won't go too much into it, but as always, in program evaluation and impact evaluation, the challenge is to find a counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened if the ACP program was not established, had not been established. We can observe that counterfactual. And that is a big challenge for all research that is trying to evaluate the impact of a program. So we use two strategies. One is called difference in difference, and the other is a regression adjustment strategy that, again, the idea is we can observe that counterfactual, but we try to approximate it as much as possible through some statistical techniques that gets us closer to that. Again, it's always closer. We'll never have the perfect experiment where we give somebody ACP, we don't give somebody ACP at random, and then we track them over time. We can do that, but we approximate that randomization through these techniques. So a little bit about the data we had. In the United States, there's a census every year. There's a census every 10 years. And in between, every year, there's something called the American Community Survey. It's a very large national survey run by the government, about 3.5 million observations. So very large. We can observe individual level data for both internet adoption and employment outcomes. We don't observe, there is no question about whether you had ACP or not. What we can see is whether somebody is eligible or not, but we cannot know whether the person actually had ACP. So this is what's called a study based on intent to treat effects. We don't know exactly who got it, who received ACP, but we know who's eligible and not eligible. So we have a pseudo panel because the ACP doesn't track people over time. So it's a pseudo panel with about 18 million observations. I'm presenting here the sort of specification that we use to calculate the effects. The key here is the intuition for this technique, difference in difference, is we use non-eligible individuals as the control group for the eligible individuals. So essentially, there's three differences involved. We look at non-eligible individuals pre and post. We look at eligible individuals pre and post, and then we look at the difference in those differences. So it's a technique that, again, essentially is using the non-eligible individuals as the control group for the eligible individuals. So what are the results? Let me start with internet adoption. Did more people have internet? Did it result in more adoption of internet? The answer is yes, but not too much. So those, you can see here, that's 2.6 percentage points of any internet. So the question is, do you have any internet or do you have high-speed internet? High-speed meaning basically fixed internet, cable, DSL, or fiber. So did more people have any type of internet? Yes, but only about 2.6% points, so about 3% above the baseline, and even lower for high-speed internet. So what's interesting is the ACP had small effect on adoption. It is statistically significant, the effect, but fairly small effect on people that adopted above and beyond what you expect without the ACP. So again, not a lot of effect, measurable, yes, but not a large effect on broadband adoption. Now, turning to the employment side. So here's perhaps where we spend the most time working out this result, because the problem with comparing employment outcomes is, imagine you're comparing everybody that's eligible and everybody that's non-eligible, which is what we do in the first one, where we just look at adoption. But the problem here is we're probably comparing a lot of eligible individuals who are very poor to a lot of non-eligible individuals who are very rich. And it's likely that the employment opportunities will perhaps have differed over time between those who are very high income and very low income, because the pandemic had very different outcomes in terms of opportunities of employment for different groups. So we had a concern that we're comparing individuals that are just fundamentally different individuals. So what do? We say, well, what if we take advantage of this threshold of 200% of eligibility? So remember, eligibility was 200% of the federal poverty line. You had to be at or below that 200 level. What if we take people that are just above and just below? So this is what we do here. We take a threshold of 175 and 225. So we only compare individuals within that narrow band of eligibility. Some are above, they're eligible, and some are below, but they're not too different because they're both near that limit, that threshold. And we don't pick it by randomly. We use a technique to optimize that bandwidth. So essentially, we're comparing eligible and not eligible, but within a very narrow set of individuals who some are just above the eligibility, so they're not eligible, and some are just below, so they are eligible, but just barely. So that's what we compare in the employment outcome studies. And What's our hypothesis? Generally, the literature would support the idea that broadband availability and adoption will increase labor force participation, will increase employment. So generally, there's a good literature to show that. But we also hypothesize that the impact will be different between male and female. And the reason is fairly apparent, which is that women value more remote work arrangements than male workers. And that's well established in the literature, and is still the reality in our society that women undertake more of the care work and household work than men, so that they would value more labor opportunities that are flexible in terms of remote work arrangements, which necessitates, obviously, having broadband at home. So our hypothesis is that women will benefit more, and the impact, therefore, will be more visible among female than male workers. So here are the results, and essentially we do show, or we do find, that the labor force participation and employment for female are, the impact is a positive for the female, but not for male. It's a small impact of 1.2 percentage points, 1.4 percentage points, but still a significant impact. As you probably know, changing labor force participation and employment is very difficult. So even a 1%, 1.5% impact is actually a very large impact in terms of changing those variables. So we do find that the ACP did result in increase in both employment and labor force participation for women, but not for male workers. Now, what's behind that? For that, we turn to another survey, which is the current population survey. So as I said, the census happens every 10 years. The ACS happens every year. The CPS happens every month. This is a monthly survey. This is actually the survey that underpins a lot of the inflation data and employment data that's produced every month. And the good thing about the CPS is it has actual questions both about work from home, which are not in the other survey, and about ACP participation. The government actually included a question about, do you receive ACP when ACP existed? So it's a smaller survey, much smaller, but we know exactly who received the subsidy, and we know exactly who work from home. And in fact, there's two variables. One is, do you work from home at all? Yes or no? Do you do any work from home? And how many hours of work from home do you do relative to all the hours that you work? So it's what's called the extensive margin, meaning how many people did any work from home, and the intensive margin, which is how many hours of work from home happen as a total of hours worked. And we use, again, a technique to try to approximate the causal effects, what's called a regression-adjusted model, that I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A. So what are the results? So we did find that there was an impact for both male and female workers in terms of incidence of work from home, meaning more women work from home that receive ACP, more women work from home. So you see the baseline here, as you expect, so it's down here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's 14% of women do any work from home versus 9% of men. That makes sense. But the impact is larger for women than for men. And it's actually quite large, the impact for women. If you look at the impact over the baseline, it's almost 20% of impact. So a lot more work from home among women that receive the subsidy. Some more work from home on the men as well, but not as much as the impact on women. And on the intensive margin, how many hours relative to total hours, you see men work 7% of the time from home, women work 11%, and the impact here is actually fairly comparable in terms of the impact of receiving ACP on the share of hours worked from home. So overall, we believe this validates the idea that the impact that we observe of ACP on labor force participation and employment in particular have to do with more opportunities related to work from home, more remote work arrangements, which were very much essential in the pandemic. But even now in the post-pandemic time, we see that they haven't changed as fast as we thought they would change. And still we see a lot of companies, a lot of organizations that are having a lot of flexible remote work arrangements, which again necessitate residential broadband. So, wrapping up. First of all, impact evaluation, our general findings about the ACP program is it did help with broadband adoption. It did have a positive net effect, but fairly small. If you calculate number of households, it's probably around 1.5 million households, which is not a lot. It's a small change from the baseline. So just a more narrow look at, did ACP help bring people online? The result is not very impressive. The effect on labor and labor force participation and employment is a lot more impressive, because again, even that 1.5% change in labor force participation means a lot more women participating in the job market. So what we are still working and trying to calculate is, can we approximate a cost-benefit analysis? And this is something that very much helps policymakers evaluate a program, is did the benefit outweigh the cost of the program or not? So here, a preliminary calculation, we take work from Weinstein, which associates a 1% increase in female labor force participation with a 0.5 increase in median wages. And actually, this is for all workers, not just for women, which means that if you extrapolate, so again, we're doing fairly simple linear extrapolations here, where, well, if it's 1%, 0.5, 2%, which is what we find, is a 1% increase in median wages. And if you multiply a 1% increase in median wages by wages in the US and workers, you essentially get around $100 billion a year in benefit. And that far outweighs, it's far bigger than the program cost, which was per year about $8.5 billion. So again, this is preliminary, what we call back of envelope calculations, but suggests that when you factor in the spillover to better employment, the benefit of the program is far above the cost of the program. So in conclusion, we argue that broadband subsidy programs must look beyond the first order impacts. That is, how many more subscribers, how many more households are connected. Because we know that there are many spillover effects from broadband adoption, spillover effects on education, on telehealth, on employment, many other areas, government services, many other areas. In this case, we document how ACP was able to expand labor opportunities for women and for men as well, but women were taking more advantage of this remote work arrangements, very dynamic labor market segments. And then something that is perhaps not always taken into account, but perhaps must be factored in more relevant in the design and targeting of subsidy programs, is that it's not just about getting people connected, but also what are the spillover effects that will come after the connection that have to be taken into account and eventually measured after in the impact evaluation of the program. Just to point you to the two papers that are perhaps summarizing some of those results. One is a paper that we presented at TPRC last year. That's a top paper. And the second paper that's more narrowly focused on the stigma issues, that it's already published in this link. And just to conclude, obviously this is collaborative work. These are my collaborators, and I should always mention we received funding from Pew to do this work that we now continue to do. If I have maybe 2 more minutes, we continue to do work. Now that ACP was defunded, there's no longer the benefit. Now the discussion has pivoted into reforming Lifeline, and also at the state level, how could state law promote more affordable broadband plans for certain segments of the population? There's a lot of discussion around the eligibility threshold, whether 200 is right, whether 150 is right, whether 125 is right. So we're working through a lot of these questions and supporting the policymakers and the advocates that are discussing these issues. So thank you very much. And now I'll open for questions.
Thank you very much, Hernan. And as you said before, we are going to change to Portuguese para que todos fiquem tranquilos e possam fazer questões que desejarem, né? Essa será a primeira palestra do ciclo bilíngue, né? Em que nós vamos registrar assim. Nós temos já uma interessada, acho que apenas queria ressaltar a importância do que foi falado e do estudo do professor Hernan Galperin. Esses estudos eles são raros no Brasil, né? Nós temos muitas pesquisas em andamento, mas as pesquisas em geral são pesquisas para planejamento dos programas de subsídios e com base em certos pressupostos, e pouco se investe em pesquisas para averiguação dos efeitos concretos, né? Mesmo com uma demanda expressa agora em legislação e normatização regulatória, em que se exige do regulador uma avaliação de resultado regulatório, né? E essa matéria ela precisa realmente ser muito mais ampliada no campo nacional. Eu também tenho as minhas questões, mas vamos passar aqui para o público primeiro. A primeira questão é da Ana Cecília. Por favor.
Boa noite, professor. Consegue me ouvir?
Sim. Sim, claro. Sim, perfeito.
Posso fazer a pergunta em inglês, se eu preferir, ou em português?
Não, eu compreendo português perfeitamente. Falo atrapalhado, mas eu entendo português.
Então, tá certo. Então, eu tenho um interesse em direito concorrencial e eu sei que uma grande preocupação nesse mercado é tentar usar estratégias da concorrência em mercados regulados, né, e para poder resolver problemas nesses mercados. Então, eu estava pensando se nesse mercado em específico, nesse programa, se o senhor acredita que tem algum problema, se pode ter algum efeito esse trabalho direto com os preços, né? Como é que isso pode afetar a concorrência, o mercado de uma maneira geral?
Great. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna respond in English, but I understand the question. Let me actually backtrack. So thank you for the question, Anna. Let me backtrack. it's interesting that ACP and Lifeline and all those programs were not supported by a lot of researchers and advocacy and policymakers that said the ultimate problem is broadband is too expensive in the US. And ultimately, it's too expensive because of lack of competition. So there were a lot of interesting questions around competition at the very beginning, where I think there are legitimate arguments to say, if we want to address affordability, by giving a subsidy to a near monopolist, we are rewarding the monopolist or the near monopolist, and we are entrenching the near monopolist. And I think these are questions worth taking very seriously. One example, or one indication of this that validates this idea is a lot of the large ISPs love ACP. Comcast, for example, was taking about $1 billion a year in ACP. So that, again, I think that deserves to be asked. The question is, because is ACP or Lifeline or any consumer subsidy necessary because the mechanisms of competition are not working? And I think that's a valid question. And it's probably true in many areas. Now, there are areas that we know that competition is unlikely and unfeasible for a number of reasons. So perhaps those areas would need both a network subsidy and a consumer subsidy to operate. But I would say I agree with some of the critics that were saying with such a wide net of the subsidy reaching everybody, 40% of the US households, a lot of times the near monopolist was being rewarded rather than attack the root cause of the problem, which is residents cannot afford because of lack of competition. So I hope I answered your question, Anna, and connecting this to the larger debate on competition.
Respondeu sim, professor. Muito obrigada.
Eu vou pegar o gancho, Hernan, porque a sua fala, ela agradaria muito a Anatel, em um programa que eles implementaram, exatamente para tentar expandir a competição, em que eles reduziram as obrigações de empresas consideradas de pequeno porte para a expansão da banda larga. E talvez fosse essa troca esperada, né, por eles. Hoje é um pouco questionado o resultado, mas o fato é que, numericamente, existem hoje mais consumidores de banda larga no Brasil das empresas de pequeno porte do que nas grandes incumbentes, né, das incumbents. E isso acabou gerando uma situação inédita, né, de que o fato de eliminarem algumas obrigações, e várias dessas de direitos dos consumidores, da acessibilidade, obrigações que dizem respeito aos direitos fundamentais dos consumidores, né? Isso facilitou e viabilizou o ingresso de mais de 8.000 empresas prestadoras de serviço de banda larga no país. E aquilo que era concentrado em 4, 5 empresas passou a ser distribuído por essas 8.000 empresas. E agora os maiores prestadores são eles, né? No conjunto, claro. Só que isso acabou gerando o efeito de que metade dos consumidores de banda larga não tem os mesmos direitos da outra metade de consumidores de banda larga, embora o efeito concorrencial tenha evidentemente gerado uma competição e uma diminuição do preço e aumento da qualidade, enfim, embora parte dessas obrigações fossem exatamente de confirmação da velocidade prometida pelos pequenos prestadores de serviços. Então, realmente é uma equação complexa em que Por exemplo, se o Brasil poderia ter subsidiado, e ele subsidia, evidentemente, né? Mas em programas que não têm tantos estudos de resultado, mas a grande fala da Anatel, da agência, é no sentido de que a atuação dela foi a grande atuação de ampliação dos serviços para os consumidores que antes não tinham acesso, e a maior parte desses casos de pequenos prestadores é em cidades que pouco atendidas, pequenas cidades no interior do país, e que as grandes operadoras entendiam que não eram atraentes, né? Mas depois dessas pequenas empresas ingressarem nessas cidades, aquilo que grandes operadoras tinham, perderam, porque elas praticamente quase todos os casos foram obrigadas a se retirar dessas pequenas cidades e somente o pequeno prestador se mantém lá por diversas outras questões, uma de natureza tributária, que acaba que o pequeno prestador tem um benefício tributário que o grande não, e isso reflete diretamente no preço do serviço,
Claro,
né?
claro.
Então, assim, esse é o cenário que se
Sim,
construiu nos últimos poucos anos aqui no Brasil. Essa
muito,
mudança aconteceu de 5, 6 anos para cá, tá? Só para
muito
você ter
interessante.
essa visão.
Yeah.
Uhum.
Não, muito interessante, Márcio. If I may comment on this, the reality is the biggest beneficiaries of ACP were the large, very large operators, the Comcast, the AT&Ts, those were the very beneficiaries. The small operators that, for the most part, participated, they accepted ACP. And again, this is from conversations that I had, is one of the challenges was this was always seen as an emergency one-time appropriation. So for a small operator to make an effort and deploy service to more areas, but not knowing if the subsidy will be there in 1 or 2 years, was a very risky proposition. Whether it's not for Comcast and for AT&T. So the large operators were all in the subsidy. The small and medium size were less, more lukewarm, more hesitant, even though they participated, but they promoted less. And we actually did a study. This was not published, but there's well, everything I say about data in the United States could be changing, because as you've been, I don't know if you've been following, but the new government has implemented a number of things that are we don't know what's going to happen with data availability. But until recently, you could actually go to a site called governmentspending.usa or something like that and see every expenditure of the US government. So we filtered that for ACP, and we documented how the major beneficiaries disproportionately were the larger companies. There was a little bit of asymmetric regulation, Marcio, in the ACP on the margins. There was some asymmetries. For example, what's called we have Native American reservations in the U.S. So if you're an operator in a Native American reservation, the subsidy would go to 75 from 30, which is a very significant change. There was also a mechanism that the operator could show the FCC that because the area was so high cost, the 75%, the $75 was warranted instead of the 30. So there were on the margins a few asymmetric elements to ACP, but for the most part it was and I think that's one of the criticisms, or perhaps some of the things, that it happened so fast. The pandemic happened so fast. Things needed to be done that the government decided, well, let's cast a very wide net that is treating everybody equally.
Excelente. Realmente, comparar as políticas públicas dos países é um exercício muito interessante, né? Na primeira liberação do Fundo de Universalização de Serviços de Telecomunicações aqui no Brasil, que ficou durante 20 anos sem uso, né? E só começou a ser utilizado há cerca de 1 ano e pouco atrás, mas depois do governo zerar a conta, os valores que estavam lá depositados e transferir para o superávit primário e passar a usar somente aquelas entradas, né, que acontecessem do reinício, né, do fundo para cá. Mas mesmo assim, isso já é em torno de mais de 1 bilhão por ano, né, de reais, né, em torno de 300 milhões de dólares, né, por ano, né? Um pouco menos, 200 milhões de dólares por ano. Então, essa, os grandes, o governo propôs um programa de banda larga nas escolas do interior do país, escolas públicas em geral, e somente uma grande operadora a, a, se interessou, e a maior parte dos que atuaram e que venceram as propostas de empréstimo, no caso, facilitadas, vieram dos pequenos provedores, né? Então, talvez pela própria modelagem, né, dos incentivos, os pequenos acabaram sendo mais incentivados a ingressar nessa atuação, e os grandes não, né? Enfim, essas são medidas também recentes. Isso aconteceu do ano passado para cá, né? Bem, teria mais alguém? A Ordanca, por favor.
Boa tarde, professor. Meu nome é Ordanca, como o professor já falou. Eu gostaria de saber o que poderia ser feito, o que o senhor pensa que poderia ser feito para um programa de conectividade perdurar, para um programa de conectividade ter uma longa duração. Essa é a minha pergunta. Obrigada.
Thank you. This is a great question, and perhaps I think something that's implicit in your question, perhaps, is we've seen a lot of programs that work in the short term but are not sustainable. We've seen a lot of connectivity programs that are just not sustainable. Some for political reasons, some for other reasons that are not sustainable. So typically we think of some people call the three-legged stool. You need availability. You also want affordability. And the third one is perhaps the one that we pay usually less attention, is literacy, is education, is helping people understand and creating the incentives for people to go online in ways that benefit their life. And that's a really interesting question that is, to my mind, understudied and under research, and because it's a difficult question. I sometimes work with some of your colleagues in Brazil, for example, at the NIC. No, what is it, Marcio? The NIC and NIC BR and the center there. The Alexandre is there. The center there, the research center.
O CGI-BR tem NIC-BR dentro dele como grupo de pesquisa, né?
Pesquisa, sim. And sometimes the answers, people say, well, I don't have broadband at home because I don't need it. And that's something that's always puzzling for researchers, is to understand how come, what is it in people don't need it. Part of the work that we're doing on employment is trying to show that, well, perhaps people, it's a deceiving answer, because clearly having broadband at home opens a number of opportunities that would far outweigh the cost of broadband if you're able to do more remote work, if you're able to improve your education, your children's education, telehealth consultations, so many things. But that, I think, part of it is what often is implied or often is difficult in terms of sustainability, is particularly after the subsidy is over. And this is something that we're working now. So all those people that were signed up with ACP, they lost the $30. Are they going to continue? Are the benefits that they are deriving and from broadband enough for them to sustain this connectivity despite ACP not being there? And that's one of the questions we're working. Interestingly, some of the ISPs have maintained some of the offers, the $29.99 that I was referring. So a lot of the ISPs, large ISPs, saying, despite ASP not exist anymore, we will continue to offer this very low cost service. Some even below $29.99. So there's a lot of interesting things, but I think you have a good question, which is, by no means it's obvious that some of these programs are sustainable in time, and sometimes I think policymakers focus too much on short-term results, but ultimately this is about long-term connectivity and long-term in improving connectivity to improve lives over the long term.
Obrigada.
É só uma correção, realmente. Dentro do NIC-BR tem o CETIC-BR, que é o responsável
CETIC,
pelas
exactly.
pesquisas. CETIC.
CETIC, thank you, Márcio.
Muito bem. Enfim, professor Hernan, nós não temos mais perguntas, mas certamente surgirão outras que, pelo interesse que despertou a sua palestra, eu acho que foi um evento importantíssimo para nos abrir os olhos para a importância de uma pesquisa que evidencia os resultados e evidencia as razões de sucesso e insucesso. Eu até ia lhe perguntar se conhecia casos em que realmente a administração tem cedido aos resultados da pesquisa para reconformar a política pública e o novo programa, né? Porque é raro de mudanças governamentais, né, permitirem que esses programas realmente se beneficiem dos aprendizados dos programas anteriores, né? E se puder só endereçar essa última questão e daí caminhamos para o encerramento.
Claro. It's a great point. I think it goes to the broader question of how much is research and evidence-based policy being really implemented. And I think sometimes there's maybe a myth that, well, in the US, policy is always very evidence-based. And I can assure you, and looking at the last 20 years of broadband policy in the US, it's program after program that didn't show very good results and yet keeps getting refunded and getting more funding. And it has to do with the political economy, Marcio. The political economy is such that there's the entrenched interest between the operators and some of the legislatures to build into the budget policies that we know had very small results. And we've shown that. We've shown that, for example, with particularly the rural broadband programs. They're called CAF1, CAF2, ROF. Those are different acronyms for the rural broadband programs. Had very little improvements to show. So it's a challenge, I think, for countries all over the world, including the US, to do this the right way. I think perhaps going back to the first question, that paying more attention to competition policy, to the basics, so we address the root cause more than we address the symptoms, because ultimately lack of affordability is perhaps a symptom of market failures, of a market that is not properly functioning, and the failure in the US to implement network fee policies and to really have a robust competition in broadband at the local level, because competition is broadband is local. It doesn't matter if you have 6,000 ISPs. The problem is how many ISPs you have competing for the local customers, right? So those are the challenges. But I'm grateful for the opportunity. I have to say, deve ser bem tarde lá em Brasília, né? Então eu agradeço na sexta-feira, verdade?
Sexta às 9 da noite já.
Nós no público, and always grateful to help and participate and be involved with UNB and your program, Marcio.